Those were the last words my husband expected me to hear that afternoon. The problem was that I wasn't sitting at home in Evansville waiting for him to come back from another business trip. I was standing 20 feet away from him in the lobby of the Louisville Marriott downtown, and I had just watched him walk through the front doors holding hands with another woman. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. The phone was still pressed against my ear. I could hear the background noise from his call, muffled voices, maybe a television, the sound of a door closing. Then he hung up. I lowered my phone slowly. Tom never looked in my direction. He was too busy smiling at the blonde woman beside him. 32 years of marriage suddenly felt very far away. The lobby around me continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. Guests rolled suitcases across the polished floor. A family argued over directions to the elevator. Someone laughed near the coffee kiosk. Meanwhile, my entire life felt like it had stopped. Tom leaned toward the woman and whispered something. She laughed. Then they headed toward the elevators. I stood frozen until the elevator doors closed. Only then did my legs start working again. I found an empty chair near a fake palm tree and sat down before I collapsed. My hands were shaking. Not because I was surprised. Deep down, I think I had known something was wrong for months. I just never expected confirmation to arrive like this. My name is Linda Harper. I'm 58 years old, retired after 30 years as a school secretary in Evansville, Indiana. For most of my life, I considered myself practical. I balanced checkbooks. I packed lunches. I remembered birthdays. I was the woman who always had extra batteries in a kitchen drawer and a list for every grocery trip. Tom used to joke that I could organize a tornado. For decades, we had what most people would call an ordinary marriage. Not perfect, not terrible, just ordinary. We raised 2 children, paid off our mortgage, sat through soccer games and graduations, argued about money occasionally, watched television together at night, built a life. At least that's what I thought. The changes started about 8 months earlier. Little things at first. Tom began traveling more often for work. He worked as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company based near Louisville. The extra travel wasn't impossible to believe. Business changes. Markets change. Companies restructure. At least that's what he told me. Then his phone became permanently attached to him. Bathroom, garage, back porch, everywhere. If it buzzed, he looked at it immediately. If I walked into the room, he flipped it face down. One evening, I noticed a new bottle of cologne in the bathroom. Tom hadn't worn cologne regularly in years. New product sample, I asked casually. He smiled. Something like that? The answer felt rehearsed. Another time he came home from a trip with a new shirt I'd never seen before. Then another. Then another. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to create questions. Questions I kept pushing away. At our age, you don't want to become one of those suspicious spouses who sees betrayal behind every closed door. I wanted proof before I allowed myself to believe anything. The proof arrived because of a credit card statement. 3 weeks before the hotel incident, I was reviewing our monthly expenses. Retirement had made me even more careful with finances. A charge caught my attention. Louisville Marriott downtown. 2 nights. The problem was that Tom had told me he'd stayed at a Hampton Inn outside the city because his company had negotiated discounted rates. I mentioned it over dinner. He barely looked up from his plate. Plans changed. That was it. No explanation. No details. Just plans changed. Something inside me stayed unsettled. The following weeks became a blur of uncertainty. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The sudden business trips. The secretive texting. The emotional distance. Then came the trip that changed everything. Tom left on a Tuesday morning. He said he had client meetings in Louisville and would return Thursday evening. I smiled, kissed his cheek, watched him drive away, then spent most of the day staring at the kitchen window. By Wednesday afternoon, I had made a decision. I convinced myself I was being romantic. Not suspicious. Romantic. I'd drive to Louisville, book a room, surprise him with dinner. Maybe we'd reconnect. Maybe I'd realize my fears were ridiculous. The drive from Evansville took a little over 2 hours. I listened to classic rock stations and drank gas station coffee. The entire trip I kept telling myself I was probably overreacting. Good marriages survive rough patches. People get busy. People change. By the time I reached downtown Louisville, I almost turned around. Then I saw his car, parked in the hotel garage, exactly where the credit card charge said he'd be. I checked the front desk. The clerk wouldn't confirm room information. Understandably. Privacy rules. So I sat in the lobby, waiting. At first I felt foolish. Then I decided to call him. That's when he answered with irritation. "Stop calling me, I'm in a meeting." Seconds later, he walked through the front doors. Not alone. Holding hands with a woman who couldn't have been older than 40. Maybe younger. She was attractive. Well-dressed. Confident. The kind of woman who looked like she belonged in magazine advertisements. Tom looked happier than I'd seen him in years. That hurt more than the affair itself. I watched them disappear upstairs. For a long time, I sat there staring at the elevator. Eventually, practicality returned. The same practicality that had carried me through every difficult moment of my life. I wasn't going to scream in a hotel lobby. I wasn't going to create a scene. Not yet. Instead, I walked back to the front desk. The young clerk looked up. "Can I help you?" I smiled politely. "I need a room for tonight." 20 minutes later, I was sitting inside my room on the 9th floor. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, on the same floor where I'd seen Tom and the woman disappear. Outside my window, Louisville's evening lights were beginning to glow. Inside, my marriage was falling apart. Around 9 o'clock, I stepped into the hallway. The corridor was quiet. I walked slowly toward the far end. Then I saw them. Tom and the woman exiting a room together, laughing. Comfortable? Familiar? Like two people who had done this many times before. They kissed briefly before entering the room again. The door closed, and I finally received the proof I'd been searching for. But what happened the next morning would turn out to be even stranger. Because when Tom checked out of the hotel, someone was waiting for him. Someone who knew exactly what he had been hiding. And whatever was inside that envelope turned his face completely white. The next morning, I woke up after maybe 2 hours of sleep. The hotel room clock read 6:17 a.m. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then reality returned. Louisville. The Marriott. Tom. The woman. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the patterned carpet. My stomach felt hollow. Not angry. Not yet. Just exhausted. 32 years is a long time. When you've spent that many years building a life with someone, your mind doesn't immediately accept that everything you believed may have been a lie. I took a shower, got dressed, and walked downstairs. Part of me wanted to drive home immediately. Pack Tom's belongings. Call a lawyer. Tell my children. Be done with it. The other part wanted answers. I needed to understand how long this had been happening. Who she was. Why he had thrown away everything we'd built. I ordered coffee from the lobby cafe and found a seat where I could watch the elevators without being obvious. Around 8 o'clock, guests began checking out. Business travelers rolled suitcases toward the front desk. Families gathered near the entrance. A wedding party wandered through looking tired and slightly hungover. I sat quietly nursing the same cup of coffee. At 8:42, I saw them. Tom and the woman stepped out of the elevator together. She wore sunglasses despite being indoors. He looked relaxed. Comfortable. Like a man who had slept well. The sight irritated me more than I expected. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the entire night questioning my marriage. Meanwhile, he looked refreshed. They approached the front desk. I pretended to look at my phone. The woman stood slightly behind him while he completed checkout. The clerk typed something into her computer. Then she paused. "Mr. Harper." Tom smiled. "Yes?" The clerk reached beneath the counter. "There was an envelope left for you." I watched her hand it over. Nothing remarkable about it. Just a plain white envelope. No markings. No logo. No return address. Tom looked puzzled. The woman leaned closer. "What's that?" she asked. He shrugged. "No idea." Then he opened it. Everything changed. I watched the color drain from his face. Literally drain. 1 second he looked normal. The next he looked like he'd seen a ghost. His jaw tightened. His eyes widened. The woman noticed immediately. "Tom," no answer. "What's wrong?" Still nothing. He stared at whatever was inside. Then folded the paper quickly. Too quickly. Like he didn't want anyone else seeing it. Especially her. "What is it?" she asked again. He forced a smile. "Nothing." It was the least convincing smile I'd ever seen. After 32 years of marriage, I knew every version of Tom's face. His happy face. His frustrated face. His nervous face. This was pure panic. The woman frowned. "That doesn't look like nothing." Tom shoved the envelope into his jacket pocket. "We need to go." The woman looked confused. "Breakfast. We need to leave." Immediately. They walked out together, but something had changed. The relaxed confidence was gone. Tom looked distracted, agitated, like his mind was racing. I waited 30 seconds before following. Outside, I watched them reach the parking garage entrance. The woman touched his arm. He barely responded. Then they got into separate vehicles. Separate vehicles. That surprised me. Apparently they hadn't arrived together. The woman drove away first. Tom remained sitting in his car, motionless. Almost 5 minutes passed. Then he grabbed his phone and started making calls, one after another. Whoever he was trying to reach wasn't answering. Eventually, he sped out of the garage. I stood there watching until he disappeared. Then I realized I had a new problem. The affair wasn't my biggest question anymore. The envelope was. What could have frightened him that badly? I returned to the hotel. The same clerk was still working. A young woman, maybe 25. Friendly face. Dark ponytail? Her name tag said Ashley. I walked up carefully. "Excuse me?" She smiled. "Good morning." "I know this is a strange question." She waited. The gentleman who checked out earlier, the one who received the envelope. Her expression immediately became cautious. "I can't discuss guest information." "I understand." I smiled. "I'm not asking who left it." "Technically true. I'm just curious whether it was delivered this morning." Ashley hesitated. Then she lowered her voice slightly. "It was actually left late last night." "Interesting. Not much, but something." "Thank you." She nodded politely. Conversation over. I headed back to Evansville around noon. The drive home felt longer than the drive there. Every mile gave me more time to think. By the time I reached Indiana, I still hadn't decided what to do. One thing was certain. I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. That evening, Tom came home. Around 7:15. Right on schedule. Like always. I was sitting at the kitchen table. The television played softly in the living room. He walked in carrying his overnight bag. "Hey." "Hey." He kissed my cheek. The same cheek. The same lips. The same man I'd watched kissing another woman less than 24 hours earlier. The normality of it made me feel sick. "How was Louisville?" I asked. He set down his bag. "Busy." "Successful." "Very." I nodded. "Good." Then I waited. Nothing. No guilt. No confession. No hesitation. Just lies. The strange thing was that he looked nervous. Not affair nervous. Different. Several times during dinner he checked his phone. When it buzzed, he nearly jumped. Afterward, he disappeared into the garage for almost an hour. When he came back, he looked even more unsettled. That continued for days. Something had gotten under his skin. Something connected to that envelope. 3 days later, I met my best friend Carol for lunch at Cracker Barrel. Carol and I had known each other since the Reagan administration. She could tell something was wrong before I even sat down. "Okay," she said. "What happened?" I hadn't planned to tell anyone. But eventually the whole story came out. The hotel. The mistress. The envelope. Everything. Carol listened quietly. When I finished, she leaned back. "You need a lawyer." "Probably. And maybe a private investigator." I laughed despite myself. "A private investigator? Linda, you caught him cheating." She stabbed a piece of chicken with her fork. "Then some mystery envelope nearly gave him a heart attack." She pointed at me. "Those are two separate secrets." The thought hadn't occurred to me. I assumed the envelope was connected to the affair. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was something else. Something bigger. Something I hadn't even imagined. For the next several days, that possibility refused to leave my mind. Then 1 week later, I found myself sitting across from a private investigator named Gary Willis in a small office near downtown Evansville. A retired state police detective. Gray hair, reading glasses, no nonsense. I expected him to confirm what I already knew. Instead, after hearing my story, he said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Harper, in my experience, affairs are often the symptom." I frowned. "The symptom of what?" Gary folded his hands. "A bigger secret." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. I had no idea how right he was, because within 3 weeks, Gary would uncover something far worse than a mistress. Something that would make the affair look almost insignificant. And when I learned the truth, I finally understood why that envelope had terrified my husband. When I hired Gary Willis, I expected him to tell me what every betrayed wife hears. "Your husband is having an affair. Here's the proof. Here's how long it's been happening. End of story." Instead, 3 weeks later, he called me on a Tuesday morning and asked if I could come to his office immediately. His voice sounded different. Serious. Almost cautious. That scared me. By then, I'd already spent days preparing myself for bad news. Maybe the affair had been going on for years. Maybe there were multiple women. Maybe Tom was planning to leave me. I thought I was ready. I wasn't. Gary's office sat above an insurance agency in downtown Evansville. The same small office where we'd first met. Same faded carpet. Same coffee machine humming in the corner. Same framed police certificates on the wall. But Gary looked uncomfortable. and that immediately made me nervous. He waited until I sat down. Then he slid a folder across his desk. "I need you to understand something." I swallowed. "Okay, the affair isn't the biggest problem." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Gary removed his glasses. "I think your husband has been living 2 separate lives." For a moment I honestly didn't understand what he meant. 2 lives. Like a double life. That sounded ridiculous. Something from a television show. Not from Evansville, Indiana. Not from a 61-year-old sales manager who complained about cholesterol medication and lawn maintenance. Gary opened the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, addresses, bank records, property records. The first photograph showed Tom standing outside a small ranch-style house. Nothing unusual, except I didn't recognize it. The second photograph showed the same house from another angle. The third photograph showed Tom mowing the lawn. The fourth showed him carrying groceries inside. The fifth showed him hugging a young boy. I stared at the picture. The boy looked maybe 12. Dark hair, baseball cap, big smile. I looked up. "Who's that?" Gary paused. "We believe that's his son." The room went completely silent. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. "My son is 30. Gary shook his head. "Not your son." The words landed like a punch. I looked back at the photograph. The smiling boy. The familiar shape of Tom's face. The resemblance was undeniable. "No," I heard myself say it. "No." Gary quietly pushed another photograph toward me. This one showed Tom standing beside a woman outside the same house. Not the woman from the hotel. Someone else. Different hair. Different age. Different face. I felt cold. "Who is she?" "Her name is Melissa Carter." I stared. "Is she the mistress?" Gary took a slow breath. "We don't think so." My head was spinning. "If she's not the mistress, then who is she?" Gary looked directly at me. "We believe she's the mother of the boy." I sat back in my chair. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The affair suddenly felt small. Not unimportant. Just small compared to this. A hidden child. A second household. An entire secret family. How does someone hide something like that? How? Tom wasn't a truck driver crossing the country. He wasn't in the military stationed overseas. He worked normal hours. He attended Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, birthday parties. Yet somehow he'd built another life. Gary continued carefully. "The property is located outside Owensboro, Kentucky, about 45 minutes from Louisville. Close enough for frequent visits. Far enough to avoid questions. According to the investigator's timeline, Tom had been visiting regularly for over 12 years. 12 years. The exact age of the boy. I felt physically sick. Gary handed me a bottle of water. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until I tried to open it. The next hour felt like a nightmare. Every answer created 3 new questions. The house wasn't in Tom's name. It belonged to Melissa. But financial records suggested Tom had been paying many of the bills. Utilities, insurance, school expenses, medical expenses, thousands of dollars every year. Money I never knew existed. Money that should have been part of our retirement savings. Money that could have helped our children, our grandchildren. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was financial, practical. Years of deception. When the meeting finally ended, I sat in my car for almost 30 minutes. Unable to drive, unable to think clearly. The affair I could understand. People make terrible choices. People get lonely. People get selfish. But maintaining an entirely separate family for over a decade, that required planning, lies, schedules, excuses, thousands and thousands of individual decisions. Every single one made deliberately. That night, Tom sat across from me eating meatloaf while discussing a baseball game. As if nothing had changed. As if he hadn't spent 12 years deceiving me. I looked at him and wondered if I knew him at all. Then things became even stranger. 2 days later, Gary called again. This time his voice sounded genuinely surprised. "Linda." "What now?" "I found out something about that envelope." I immediately sat down. "What?" There was a pause. The envelope wasn't about the affair. I closed my eyes. Of course it wasn't. At this point, nothing would surprise me. "What was it about?" "Money." I frowned. "What kind of money?" Gary explained. Several years earlier, Tom's company had acquired a small family-owned supplier, a relatively minor acquisition. The company eventually merged operations and moved on. Nothing unusual, except someone had recently started reviewing old financial records, and discrepancies had appeared. Missing funds, questionable reimbursements, strange expenses. Nothing enormous, just enough to raise suspicion. Over time, those small discrepancies added up. A lot. The more investigators looked, the more questions they found. Then Gary said something unexpected. The envelope contained photographs. I immediately remembered Tom's reaction. The panic. The fear. The color draining from his face. What kind of photographs? Evidence. My heart started racing. According to Gary's source, someone connected to the company had gathered documentation. Pictures. Records. Transactions. Enough information to cause serious problems. The envelope had essentially delivered a message. We know. We're watching. Tom wasn't afraid of being caught cheating. He was afraid of something else. Something much bigger. The irony was almost unbelievable. The younger woman from the hotel apparently believed Tom was successful and wealthy. According to Gary's investigation, the truth was very different. Tom was drowning in debt. Credit cards. Personal loans. Borrowed money. Hidden obligations. The image he'd been selling everyone was mostly fiction, including his mistress. That realization should have made me feel better. It didn't. Mostly it made me feel tired. Weeks passed. The more information Gary uncovered, the heavier everything became. Meanwhile, I still hadn't confronted Tom. Not because I was afraid, because I was thinking, planning, trying to figure out what justice actually looked like. Then my daughter Emily complicated everything. One evening she stopped by with my 2 grandsons. After the boys went outside to play basketball, Emily sat beside me on the porch. "You've seemed distracted lately." I forced a smile. "I'm fine." She gave me the same look I'd given her throughout childhood. The "I know you're lying" look. Eventually, I told her part of the truth. Not everything. Just enough. Emily listened quietly. Then she surprised me. "Mom, what? Please don't do anything you'll regret." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means Dad deserves consequences." She paused. "But he's still their grandfather." She glanced toward the yard where the boys were laughing. And suddenly revenge didn't seem nearly as simple. Because every decision would affect more than Tom. It would affect everyone. For several days I seriously considered walking away. Quiet divorce. Private settlement. No public humiliation. No revenge. Then Gary called with one final piece of information. And the moment he told me, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Tom's company was planning a retirement banquet. A huge event. Executives. Employees. Family. Friends. Over 200 guests. And Tom would be the guest of honor. The date was 6 weeks away. For the first time since Louisville, I saw a path forward. Not easy. Not painless. But fair. And if I was going to expose the truth, I wanted everyone to hear it at the same time. For the next 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives. The first was the version everyone saw. I went grocery shopping, attended church on Sundays, met friends for coffee, babysat my grandsons when Emily needed help, smiled when neighbors waved, pretended everything was normal. The second life happened quietly behind the scenes. Phone calls, documents, meetings, evidence, planning. And the strangest part, Tom had no idea. Not a clue. If anything, he seemed more distracted than ever. The mysterious envelope had clearly rattled him. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at his phone with a worried expression. Other times he'd disappear into the garage for private conversations. Several nights I woke up and found his side of the bed empty. He'd be downstairs sitting in the dark living room. Just sitting there, thinking. Whatever pressure was building around him, it wasn't going away. Neither was mine. Some mornings I woke up convinced I should cancel everything. Just file for divorce. Move on quietly. Why create a public spectacle? What would it accomplish? Then I'd remember the photographs, the lies, the hidden family, the stolen years, and my resolve returned. Gary became my anchor during that period. Whenever I started doubting myself, he'd remind me of the facts. Not emotions, facts. You're not destroying his reputation, Linda. We were sitting in his office one afternoon reviewing documents. His actions did that. I knew he was right. But it still felt complicated. Because despite everything, Tom wasn't a stranger. He was the father of my children, the grandfather of my grandchildren, the man I'd shared 32 Christmas mornings with. You don't erase 3 decades of history overnight, even when someone deserves it. Meanwhile, Gary continued uncovering information. Some of it shocked me. Some of it almost made me laugh. The younger woman from Louisville, her name was Rachel, apparently believed Tom was preparing for a luxurious retirement. According to her social media posts, she often hinted about future travel plans, beach vacations, wine tours, mountain resorts. The reality was considerably less glamorous. Tom's finances were a disaster. Credit card balances, personal loans, missed payments. The man was essentially using debt to maintain multiple lives. At one point, Gary showed me a timeline he'd created. Looking at it felt surreal. Color-coded calendars, hotel stays, financial transactions, trips to Kentucky. It looked like a military operation. The amount of effort required to sustain so many lies was unbelievable. How did he keep track of all this, I asked. Gary laughed. Honestly, what? I'm impressed he remembered where he was supposed to be half the time. For the first time in weeks, I laughed too. A genuine laugh. Not because the situation was funny, because the absurdity finally hit me. Tom wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was a 61-year-old man desperately juggling secrets. Eventually, gravity catches up with people like that. The retirement banquet was scheduled for Friday evening at a country club outside Louisville. A large event. More than 200 invitations had been sent. Current employees, retired executives, clients, friends, family. Tom had spent months talking about it. Before everything happened, he'd been excited, proud. His career was ending on a high note. At least that's what he thought. 3 days before the banquet, Emily came over again. This time she sat across from me at the kitchen table. Neither of us mentioned the coffee growing cold between us. You're really going through with it? I nodded. I think so. Emily looked down, then back up. I don't want Dad getting away with what he did. I waited. But, she sighed. But I hate what's going to happen. So do I. That was the truth. People imagine revenge feels exciting. It doesn't. Not when it's real. Not when families are involved. Mostly it feels sad. Emily reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Whatever happens, I'm with you. That nearly broke me. Because support sounds comforting until you realize why someone needs to offer it. Friday arrived. Warm. Sunny. One of those pleasant Kentucky evenings where summer hasn't completely surrendered to fall. I drove to Louisville alone. The country club sat among rolling hills outside the city. Beautiful location. Perfectly manicured lawns. White columns. Expensive landscaping. The kind of place companies choose when they want to celebrate success. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw luxury cars everywhere. Mercedes, BMWs, Cadillacs. People were already arriving, dressed nicely, laughing, greeting old colleagues. Inside, the ballroom looked impressive. Round tables, fresh flowers, soft lighting, a large stage at the front. Near the podium stood a giant banner celebrating Tom's retirement. I stared at his smiling photograph. The irony was almost overwhelming. Several executives greeted me warmly. They all assumed I was the proud wife, the supportive spouse, the woman celebrating her husband's achievements. I smiled politely, thanked them, accepted their compliments, and waited. Around 7 o'clock the program began. Dinner first, then speeches, then awards, then Tom's retirement presentation. Everything unfolded exactly as planned, at least at first. I watched Tom move through the room, shaking hands, telling stories, accepting congratulations. He looked confident again. For the first time in weeks, whatever fear the envelope had created seemed temporarily forgotten. Then the speeches started. Several coworkers spoke. Old friends shared memories. Executives praised his dedication, his integrity, his leadership. That word nearly made me choke on my water. Integrity. If they only knew. Finally, Tom took the stage. The room applauded. He smiled, adjusted the microphone, and began speaking. For a few minutes he talked about his career, the people he'd worked with, the lessons he'd learned. Then he shifted toward family, toward loyalty, toward values. The hypocrisy became unbearable. I felt my pulse quicken. This was the moment, the one I'd spent 6 weeks preparing for. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from certainty. Tom looked directly toward my table, smiled, and thanked me publicly for supporting him throughout his career. The room applauded again. I stood up. The applause gradually faded. At first, nobody thought anything of it. Then I began walking toward the stage. The room grew quiet. Tom's smile disappeared. Something in his expression changed. Instinct. Recognition. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. I don't know. But suddenly he looked worried. Very worried. I reached the stage. The microphone stood only a few feet away. 200 people watched. Waiting. Silent. Tom stared at me, and for the first time in months he seemed to understand exactly what was about to happen. I stopped at the foot of the stage. For a second nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Tom stared at me. I stared back. 32 years of marriage stood between us. 32 years of memories, birthdays, holidays, mortgage payments, children, grandchildren, and lies, lots of lies. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. Somewhere during those 6 weeks, the anger had burned itself out. What remained was clarity. The microphone sat only a few feet away. One of the executives smiled politely. "Linda, would you like to say a few words?" I nodded. "I would." He stepped aside. I took the microphone. My hands felt steady now. Steadier than they had in months. Around the room, people smiled expectantly. They assumed they were about to hear a loving retirement tribute. A sweet story. A funny memory. Something sentimental. Instead, I looked directly at Tom. Then I began. "Most of you know Tom as a coworker." A few people nodded. "Some of you know him as a friend." More nods. I paused. "I thought I knew him as a husband." The room immediately became still. You could feel the mood change. Tom's face tightened. I continued calmly. "No one likes public embarrassment?" I glanced around the ballroom. "Especially me." A few confused looks appeared. People weren't sure where this was going. Then I pulled a folded photograph from my purse. The first photograph. The Louisville Hotel. Tom and Rachel, holding hands. I held it up. A ripple moved through the audience. Tom looked like he wanted to disappear. "I discovered recently that my husband has been having an affair." Gasps. Whispers. Silence. Then more whispers. Tom stepped toward me. "Linda." His voice sounded strained. "Please." I looked at him. "No." Then I returned my attention to the room. The strange thing was how quickly fear left me. For weeks I had imagined this moment. Now that it had arrived, I felt almost peaceful, because the truth no longer belonged only to me. It was finally in the open. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. I removed another photograph. Then another. Then another. The hidden house outside Owensboro. Melissa. The 12-year-old boy. The secret life. People stared in disbelief. One woman actually covered her mouth. An executive sitting near the front looked completely stunned. I explained everything. Carefully. Calmly. No screaming. No insults. Just facts. Dates. Locations. Evidence. The room listened. By now, Tom had stopped trying to interrupt. Maybe he realized it was hopeless. Maybe he finally understood that 32 years of deception couldn't be explained away in 30 seconds. Then came the biggest surprise of the evening. One I hadn't planned. A man stood up from a table near the back. I recognized him immediately from Gary's photographs. Frank Dawson. Tom's former business partner. The man connected to the mysterious envelope. Frank walked slowly toward the stage. Every eye in the room followed him. Tom looked terrified. Actually terrified. Frank stopped beside me. Then turned toward the audience. "My name is Frank Dawson." Nobody spoke. Frank looked directly at Tom. "Tom already knows why I'm here?" The silence somehow became even heavier. Frank pulled a folder from beneath his arm. Then he calmly explained what his own investigation had uncovered. Missing funds. Questionable reimbursements. Financial irregularities. Years of them. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing dramatic. Just documented fact, the kind investigators like. The kind attorneys understand. The kind that don't disappear. Tom's face had turned completely white. Exactly the way it had in the hotel lobby. Suddenly, the mystery of the envelope made perfect sense. The affair wasn't what scared him. Being exposed was. Frank held up a copy of the same warning letter that had been inside the envelope. I wanted him to know we had evidence. The room was frozen. Then something unexpected happened. Rachel stood up. Apparently, she'd been invited to the banquet. Maybe Tom had promised her some glamorous future after retirement. Maybe she'd expected an engagement ring someday. Who knows? What mattered was her expression. Confusion. Then realization. Then anger. Real anger. She looked at Frank. Then at Tom. Then at me. Finally, she asked a question that made half the room laugh. "Wait." She pointed at Tom. "You're broke." The timing was unbelievable. After everything that had happened, that was her first concern. Not the affair. Not the secret family. Not the investigation. The money. A few people couldn't help it. They laughed. Even I nearly smiled. Rachel shook her head in disbelief. "You told me you owned 3 properties." Nobody answered. "You said your retirement account was huge." Still silence. Then she threw her hands into the air. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Without another word, she grabbed her purse and walked out. The ballroom doors swung shut behind her. For a moment, the entire room sat stunned. Then Frank quietly returned to his seat. My part was finished. His part was finished. The truth was finally standing in the center of the room where everyone could see it. Tom remained frozen near the podium. No speech, no explanation, no defense. Just silence. The powerful, respected executive everyone had come to celebrate suddenly looked like an ordinary man trapped by his own decisions. I handed the microphone back to the event coordinator. Then I stepped away from the stage. People moved aside as I walked. Not dramatically, not like a movie. Just quietly, respectfully. Back at my table, Emily stood and hugged me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The hardest part was over. The following months weren't easy. There were attorneys, financial disclosures, difficult family conversations, more than one sleepless night. Justice rarely arrives neatly packaged. Real life is messier than that. Tom eventually lost much of what he'd spent years building. His reputation suffered. His retirement plans collapsed. Several investigations continued. Some outcomes were private. Others became public. By then, none of it mattered much to me. Because something unexpected happened after the banquet. I stopped carrying him around in my head. For months, my life had revolved around Tom's lies. Suddenly, it didn't. I sold our house the following spring. Not because I had to. Because I wanted a fresh start. I moved into a smaller place closer to my sister. Less maintenance. Less stress. More peace. I joined a travel group for retirees. Something I never would have imagined doing before. That summer, I took a bus tour through Tennessee. Nothing fancy. Just good people, roadside diners, and beautiful mountain views. One evening, sitting on a hotel balcony overlooking the Smoky Mountains, I realized something. The greatest revenge wasn't exposing Tom. It wasn't the banquet. It wasn't the public humiliation. The greatest revenge was building a life that no longer depended on him. A life he couldn't damage. A future he couldn't control. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, remember this healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes one ordinary day at a time. And if this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts and experiences. Sometimes the stories we tell each other help us move forward.